Hello and welcome to Jo's Art History Podcast, a podcast that celebrates all things art historical, with me, your host and resident art historian, Jo McLaughlin. Hello, welcome back and welcome to a brand new season. That's right, my friends, season 4 starting on the 4th of March. I didn't even do that on purpose. Very excited. And we're on episode 69. So it's March 2025, and for those of you that may not know, March is also Women's History Month. So I thought I would kick off Women's History Month with an episode about an artist that I had actually never heard of before, and that is Lee Lozano. Now, Lee Lozano, born in 1930, died in 1999, was a significant American artist who made notable contributions to the development of conceptual and minimal art in the 1960s and the beginning of the 1970s in New York. Her work, which includes painting, drawing and performance art, is known for its bold exploration of gender, power and societal norms. Lozano's career is often characterised by an unorthodox approach to both art and life, and ultimately led to her deliberate withdrawal from the art world. And joining me today to talk all things Lee Lozano is the wonderful Kelly Wu, who is a British artist based in London. Now, Kelly and I actually take you on a little bit of a whistle-stop tour of Lee's performance pieces. Now, Lee was also a painter, and in the beginning of her artistic career was very much a painter. However, she moved away from that in later life, or rather the last few years of her very short and intense but prolific art career in New York in the 1960s, before she withdrew from the art world, and Kelly and I will get under the skin of that in the episode. Kelly and I talk you through 3 of her key performance pieces. These are General Strike Piece, performed in 1969, Grass Piece, also performed in 1969, and Dropout, performed in 1970. Each piece, although radically different, does have the same vein of activism. And Kelly and I have a really interesting conversation about Lee Lozano as a feminist. For those of you that may not know, she has quite a lot of feminist associations around her work. Not that she ever called herself a feminist or associated with the movement in any way. There's a couple of statements in there that Kelly shares with us, which proves quite the opposite. There's been a lot of reflecting back on work, which art historians do, of course. We sort of look back and we project things and we can pick things apart in a modern day light that perhaps weren't very obvious, or perhaps maybe even in some cases weren't even there to begin with. But we have a great conversation around that, really interesting, and I can really see both sides of the coin in this argument, and it's a great conversation. Kelly's a wonderful guest and so passionate about sharing Lee's work and really sort of diving into what each work means and really sort of breaking that down for you. So all that's left to do is sit back and relax as Kelly and I discuss the completely fascinating life and work of Lee Lozano. Enjoy. Thank you so much for answering my open call and coming onto the podcast to talk about Lee Lozano, who I will absolutely get her surname incorrect at several points in this podcast. I've even got it written phonetically for some reason. I don't know why I can't say it. Lee Lozano, who I'm really ashamed to say, and I said this before we hit record, I'd never heard of her. And she's so fascinating. She's also a little bit bonkers, but completely fascinating.
Yeah, she's really crazy. I only learned about her last year as well. I think she's one of those artists who is not, maybe by her own choice, not really in the mainstream at all. But then once you learn about her, it's like, how did I miss this information? Because she was also working around really famous people like Richard Serra, Carl Andre, but she's just nowhere. Or I don't know if that was maybe it's a good thing because it was kind of her intention.
Yeah, I find it completely fascinating. So where did you learn about her? Because I know you're a student. So was it a university lecturer, or were you in we in a museum or a gallery? Because I know her work is shown quite regularly. Just to give people a sense of her standing now, her estate is actually, I believe, represented by Hauser and Wirth.
Yeah, I think so. Well, I've never actually seen her work in person, and all of the books that like contain her work have been so expensive or like hard to access in like closed library collections. So I feel like I've been searching for stuff. I've never seen anything in person. But last year, one of my tutors, Sabrina, she like gave us this seminar where she was talking about all sorts of different artistic failures, and she was using Lee Lozano sort of as a not as an example of failures, but just like in her work, she does sort of discuss lots of failings of society, or I don't know, lots of like institutional failings, and yeah. So then I just became like completely obsessed with her. I've been researching her a lot ever since, and just trying to like. I mean, I hope one day I'll be able to actually see something in person, but yeah.
Oh my goodness. But I love that though, when an artist just sort of comes at you from nowhere and you get completely obsessed. And I can very easily see this happening with myself because the more I've sort of read into her, and I'll be honest, she's got a very very sort of, as I'm sure you would agree, a very short but prolific career in the arts. Perhaps actually it might be a good idea if you could just give us, for anyone that's never heard of Lee Lozano, just a really sort of brief overview of who she was, what she did.
Yeah, so she was born in 1930 and she was actually born Lenore. I think she changed her name to Lee when she was 14 because I think she really wanted to go by something more masculine. And by the time she died in 1999, she was going just by E, so she just kept shortening her name. But I think her artist name and what people know her by is Lee still. And she actually did her BA in natural sciences, which is a strange beginning. But I actually feel like lots of artists do come from like the most random backgrounds, but it's really obvious to me in her drawings and things that she has that like scientific thing in her brain. But yeah, after she did her BA, she went to the Art Institute of Chicago and she did art, and then she got married, then she got divorced, la la la, and then basically was doing these expressionist, like still life, very crude, very offensive, like drawings and paintings of tools and like, I don't know, tools and genitals and like just really
Random. She had like an assortment of like a calling card, if you will, of like items that she always sort of referred back to. They're very odd paintings. They're very, very odd.
well, I started to think about how she uses clamps and that like you might use clamps a lot if you were doing scientific experiments like physics experiments or something, and maybe I don't know, this is just a speculation, maybe like it's linked like that somehow, or I don't know, in the earlier ones there seems to be so many clamps. Yeah, and then so she does those for a while and then she moves on to some different paintings, very minimalist, abstract sort of things, and then sort of stops painting altogether to do these really crazy really crazy performance pieces that she calls life art. So they're essentially just like, it's quite similar to other artists that were working in the 60s, like Yoko Ono, or Fluxus, where it's just like an instruction and she just does the instruction and she has it written down on a piece of paper as to formalize it. And then, yeah, and then she quit the art world,
Yeah,
moved
very
to her parents'
famously.
house. Yeah, and then she, I think, stayed away from the art world for like 20 years, maybe? Yeah, and then died of cervical
Yeah. Oh, I know.
cancer.
It's but she very famously resigned from the art world, or we'll say resigned in air quotes here for air quoting Kelly. You can't see, listeners can't see that. But it's these performance pieces that really, which at the end of her artistic career, which was only what, a decade long, 11, 12 years long, was really these performance pieces at the end of her career is what people know her for. And they're seen as very sort of powerful, feminist sort of statements, which to begin with, I was sort of like, what? How can that be seen as a feminist like rebellion or act. And actually, the more you dig into it, I was like, oh yeah, like because I think without context and thinking about what was happening and what was going on, they're just sort of, and also because, I think because they're all written on scrap bits of paper or notebooks, they're not presented in this very beautiful sort of artistic bound book or something that's printed and framed. It literally is just her writing these performance or these statements rather in block capitals and biro on all these different bits of paper and notebooks that are numbered. But there is a sequence and there is something that she is exploring within them, which I can't wait actually to like sort of dive into it. So let's start with one of you've sent me three, which you've scanned from one of your books that you have. And this one is called General Strike Piece. I don't know if you have the image up and if you want to read a little bit of what the strike is, or if not, I've got it here in front of me.
Yeah, I can. Give me one sec. Okay. So General Strike Piece, and it says she's written that it started February 8th, 1969, but I think some of her dates are they're mixed up sometimes. And it's just on a piece of paper. She does have more put together notebooks, but I think was just loose. It says General Strike Piece, gradually but determinedly avoid being present at official or public uptown functions or gatherings related to the art world in order to pursue investigation of total personal and public revolution. Exhibit in public only pieces which further sharing of ideas and information related to total personal and public revolution in process at least through summer 69.
Yeah. And within that as well, she also has like stars and asterisks, which she then like gives you a little bit more information. And I don't know if she added that. I'm assuming she added this later when she maybe sort of came up with the concept.
Yeah, you can't see all my air quotes.
You can't see. There was air quotes around uptown functions and air quotes around gatherings related to the air quotes art world. And essentially, so let's break this down. This is, just to give everyone a bit more context, this is 1969, this piece started, as you've said. And it was something that she did throughout the summer. But now she was established and she was showing in galleries. And I believe she was building up to her first museum show. So people knew who she was. There was a lot of buzz around her. She was getting reviewed. Her work was being debated. And she's just decided to, just on a whim almost, withdraw herself from that. Why is this considered like radical? What's your thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, even at the time, she was sort of involved with people like Lucy Lippard, who obviously very important figure for the women's liberation movement. And there was a lot of things around like organized things, organized revolution, organized art, and organized religion, which she just hated for some reason. She completely hated anything where she couldn't like be this individual person. And I think maybe she thought that art was going to be that outlet for her to like be unique and be herself. But then the more successful she got, she realized there were all these constraints, which led to her just like completely, like she was repulsed by it and she didn't want anything to do with it anymore. And this was the beginning for her dropout piece, which was even more radical and I guess unpopular because people thought that because she was a woman and she had had this success that she should almost be grateful for it, I guess.
Yeah, and I think what's really important is the word strike in here, isn't it?
Yeah.
General strike piece. Because when you think about striking, whenever you think of, you associate that word striking, I think minor strikes. I think strikes on, railway lines, whatever. People strike because they are essentially, they're seeking better working conditions and better standards.
And it's like, how does the artist strike? I guess the only way to do it is to like stop making work but she doesn't say she's going to stop making work. This is a work. It's like a strike of like corporate stuff, I guess.
Yeah. And I think what's really important to remember, these are this is a very sort of all the works we're going to talk about are very, very conceptual. They're sort of statement art pieces that she just kind of throws out into the world. What I love about it, and you know, Kelly, you're an artist. I know you're at university, but I'm assuming you've been in the art world. You know that there's a sort of dance that happens. There's this sort of performance. I call it like the pantomime of the art world, where you have to go to private views, you have to be active, you have to be doing all these things. And if you're seen as not doing these things, then you're almost sort of guilted into being like, oh, you're not doing it right, and you're not doing it properly, and you're not that dedicated. So to have, as you say, to be a woman at this time and receive that clout and that success and be allowed into these rooms, which are predominantly male filled, just want to hit that home. New York, 1969, predominantly male filled art galleries and museums and dealers. For a woman to have such a rapid rise to fame as well, very, very short rise to fame, to walk away from it is a huge act of rebellion. It's so rebellious. And it's so like, no, this isn't good enough. It's not what I want. And again, but I think when you've, this is me coming to this after a couple of hours of like reading into it and really sort of digging into theories and watching videos and being like, wow, God, this is really quite punchy and clever. But I think just to read a statement like this and then not mull over it, you would be a bit like, well, she's a bit of a nutter.
Well, I think that like it's actually, I think she would hate that we were talking about her like she's a woman, even though she is. I think so much of like, I mean, the question is like, is she a feminist or is she not? Because some people would actually say she's a misogynist, or I don't know. I think she hated the association of herself with the women that were active at that time.
Mm-hmm.
Even in the strike piece, it's like these gender undertones are really obvious to us, but she makes no mention of it at all. Like to her, it's like a completely neutral, or she wants to be perceived as like this on the same level, same clean slate as like all the male artists that she's working with.
Interesting. It's kind of like when people say, oh, she's a female artist, you're like, her gender has nothing to do with it. If you wouldn't say a male artist, you would just say an artist, which is something that happens, oh my goodness, to me every day when I'm like, oh, this female artist. And I'm like, it's just an artist. They are an artist. Yes, they are female.
Yeah, I think it depends on the context. Like it can just be a descriptor, but for her, I think she probably would have, I don't know, I just have the feeling that she would have hated it because I think to her, like, she, whether like consciously or not, did see the word woman as a insult or female artist as an insulting descriptor. I have a quote from her, one of her private books, like her notebooks that she used to keep, that where she wrote, "I'm not a feminist. I speak to both men and women because I think both men and women are slaves in today's society," which is like, it's kind of like she's always missing the point just a little bit, but she has her own little spin on, like it's nearly there, like it's close.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's maybe like the undertone for General Strike piece is just like overarching society something.
Yeah. Not happy with it. So she's going to just withdraw from it for a little bit.
Hmm.
It's kind of almost like giving yourself a summer holiday off the art world, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
I suppose that's how we could look at it. But she details her withdrawals from lots of things, events that she's turned down, concerts, gallery openings, the dates of these things. It's very, very meticulous and it's very, very dedicated. It's almost like a diary of when she performed these pieces, because I'm assuming she had lots of pieces going on at the same time while she was doing this. I'm not sure, but I would assume so. There's lots of different, if she's written them, surely you could hit a bit like any artist. You don't just work on one thing, you have several things going on, or you have lots of sketchbooks going on and stuff like that. But I very much enjoyed this as like my introduction to Lee. And then there's another piece from the same year. And actually, I'm going to completely go back on what I said. There is absolutely no way well, maybe not actually, because there's some April dates in here. So the next piece I'm going to talk about is the grass piece, which
I think the order goes General Strike, then Grass Piece.
yeah, I'm looking at General Strike, and there's a couple. Sorry, I'm sort of working things out in my head. On General Strike Piece, there's things where she's like, oh, I came out of this event, I didn't go to this event, and she's like documented dates in April. But Grass Piece is a work that I think is done in April, if I can remember. Let me get it up.
They must overlap.
Yeah, so they must overlap. That's why I'm saying I'm backtracking on what I've just said. Like, yeah, absolutely. These must have overlapped, although I don't know how much overlap. Do you want to explain to people a little bit about Grass Piece?
Okay, let me read from the Grass piece of paper. Make a good score about a lid of excellent grass. Smoke it up as fast as you can. Stay high all day, every day. See what happens. So if we're saying that it overlapped, I feel like, I mean, maybe they were perfectly intertwined because she didn't have to go out and she could do this.
And she could, yeah, completely dedicate her, what turns into almost over a month of her essentially getting high every day.
Yeah.
As part of this performance piece. And it's dated as well. So the first statement is April 1st, 69. And then it moves on and it says, one thing that happens is that it takes more and more grass to get feeling good. Immunity building up, ? April 17th, 69. And then she continues, the amount of grass needed to get high is stabilized itself. Tonight I started to smoke the last container of clean shit. Then, oh my goodness, I can't even read her writing. Clean shit.
Messy.
When that is gone, there are what looks like twigs to smoke and a lot of seeds, which I'm going to eat. Oh my goodness.
Oh yeah, she eats the seeds. I remember reading this in her private book that she couldn't get them down in the end.
What are the seeds? The sort of marijuana sort of seeds? Or
Yeah. Just like the little crumbs at the end.
Got you. Oh, got you.
That's what she means, yeah.
Interesting. And again, that's April 24th that's dated.
Yeah, I think then afterwards maybe she gets sick of it because she then makes the no grass piece very shortly after, I think 33 days after, where she just doesn't smoke weed for like the same amount of time. And these are profound artworks.
Yeah, this is it. These are like debate inducing book writing artworks. And I love that kind of in a way shows that art doesn't need to be this like really highly intellectual thing. It can just be, I'm going to make sort of abusing my body an art piece for, well, I suppose it's very similar to what Yoko Ono was doing. You're totally right in terms of like what was happening at the time, like using your body as a physical means to make an artwork.
What is interesting is like, even though, I mean, it was the 60s, so Yoko was working there at the same time, and like other famous artists like Eva Hesse, but like she never really spoke to them or interacted with Fluxus. Like it, even though it was similar, like she wasn't interested in that at all. Like she stayed in her bubble of male minimalist sculptors. It's very strange, and it doesn't seem like it would match up to her way of thinking. Like when you look at Solowitz's work, like it seems like it has nothing to do with like this later, more, I guess, like honest and more like true to herself works. Yeah.
Yeah. And what's the significance of Grass Piece then? What are scholars sort of saying about it? What's the takeaway of why this piece is so pivotal?
I don't know what scholars are saying about it. I feel like, okay, for me, General Strike Piece, she drops out pretty much from work, and then the next step, obviously, in her trying to be like this degenerate version of herself is to smoke loads of weed. And then during this period, she also has dialogue piece. See, they're all running at the same time. And dialogue piece is literally just where she invites her friends or people that she wants to speak to, like up to her loft, and she has a conversation with them. And then she stops getting high. So it's like all these three things running in tandem. And like, I think the importance of it is that she removes herself from what she's supposed to be doing and completely does what she's not supposed to be doing, and it's more successful. And it's like,
Mm.
it is like a protest in a sort of, I mean, it is a protest. I think she would say that too, but it's not a protest in the original way. It's very passive. It's very, it's like she doesn't need to do a lot, but it's making a big statement about
Mm.
the state of things, the state of the world, and what people consider to be work. Yeah.
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head. I think that's beautifully put. Really, really fascinating. So, what are your thoughts? Or I don't know if you've read anything that talks about this idea that her smoking all this weed for a month to make this sort of grand statement is actually her essentially opening up the commentary of, if, well, no one would comment if it was a man doing this. So like, or do you think that's, we're sort of looking back at it with sort of a feminist tilt, a bit like General Strike piece?
I think we do project own feminism onto her, because I think just even reading her notes, that it's not in her consideration, like her gender isn't really like in her own considerations of her or herself, even though like it's so obvious to me what she's doing. Or maybe she did know, but she just like refused to acknowledge it. I don't know what.
I don't know. I actually see this as a bit of an experiment. This is what I see this as. And again, it's going back to like her earlier training. She's documenting notes. It's almost like a medical trial of herself. Like, this happened on this day.
Yeah.
Oh, by this time it was this. Oh, I've now run out of this. I've tried to do this. It's an analog. You're documenting what's going on in this experiment that she's called a performance piece.
Definitely, she completely like surrenders her body to they are experiments, definitely. And it's like, I feel like she spent a lot of time by herself, and at certain points in her writings, she sort of gives the impression that she couldn't really care if she lived or died. She's just going to do the experiment, and
Mm.
like it could result in anything. Like it doesn't seem like she has too much interest in like building up her life. She just takes it day by day and does the work. Hmm.
Sort of very sort of responsive to her environment and how she's feeling in that moment, sort of thing, which is what all artists do, I suppose, when you're on this, when you're working your way through a series, which this is, it's a series of works. I find this so fascinating, and I would love, and I never actually got the chance to, or even thought to look it up, to read about the counterpiece, as you've mentioned, which is the no grass piece, which is when she then, for the same amount of time, doesn't smoke weed. Because by the end of it, she's essentially like, by the end of like the smoking or the grass piece, she's completely numb and she's really sort of leveled herself out in terms of her tolerances. And she actually ends up taking a psychedelic just to sort of go out with a bang, so to speak, at the end of this.
Yeah, she loved psychedelic. Yeah.
To be honest with you, I can kind of see that, and particularly her like last ever piece that she did in 1972 in London, which was essentially her for a week at Listen Gallery, just organising sand into rows, which I think is bonkers, but also quite meditative at the same time. But yeah, she's not afraid to like push her body to the limits. And again, this is just, it's very sort of like factual. This is what's happened. There's no real emotion or like anger or upset in any of her pieces as well. It is very just like, did this, this is the date, this happened, here's a thought about it, we'll move on, which I think is also quite interesting.
Yeah, I think that this is like the scientist in her coming back out. It reads like a lab book.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, totally, totally. Okay, then let's move on and talk about the final work. So this is again 1969, and one of her final pieces is called Dropout,
Yes.
performed in 1970. Do you want to read Dropout? Because this is a great example of just her sort of writing in sort of notebooks and everything's numbered. It's a really wonderful image that for anyone listening, I'll share on my Instagram.
See, I think there's actually probably a better image of the dropout piece, but this is the one I picked out from the private notebook because it just says at the bottom, dropout piece is the hardest work I've ever done. So I think that's like maybe almost one of the first times you really feel that she's struggling with it. Because essentially with dropout piece, she just decided to sort of stop talking to everyone, stop working, and just stop doing anything. And it was, yeah, it was a continuation and like exaggeration of general strike piece, which eventually left to like it meant that she wasn't getting any money. And so she couldn't pay her rent. So then she got evicted from her loft at like the end of 1971.
It's quite a drastic challenge to set yourself. Just completely withdraw, stop making work, stop interacting, stop going to places. I was reading that it's been considered that in doing that, she's trying to like open up a conversation with the idea of the artist and the viewer. And if the idea that an artist always has to be prolific and making and present in order to be worthwhile or worthy of talking about or being considered as part of the in group. And I read this really interesting article, which I will leave a link to in the show notes if anyone wants to sort of dive into it a little bit further, about the idea that but her doing this is her sort of rebelling against the idea that at any point I can withdraw and you'll still want to talk about my work.
Yeah, that's so true.
And in fairness, spot on. This is what, 2025?
Yeah, here we are.
And here we go. It's incredibly brave, which is a rubbish word to use, but very like risky as well. And I don't know, I think this in itself could be subject to a debate if we had like a psychologist, an art historian, or somebody else, like a whole panel of people sort of ripping this apart in terms of what the means could be to go about this. And what's your thoughts?
I think she was always like completely willing to sacrifice anything just to scratch an itch that she had, just to like literally like, get an idea out of her system that she wanted to do. She would be willing to like drop everything, drop out. And I don't know what the timeline is, but this is the same time that she does her boycott of women as well.
Oh, yes, which is
Yeah.
bizarre because this was the boycott of women. Did it start as a lecture? How did it start?
I have no idea. I
Okay.
think basically she wanted, the quote I have is that she wanted to boycott women for a while to make communication better than ever. But then she, from like 1971 onwards, like after she drops out of the art world and stuff, she literally never speaks to women again, allegedly. And I think Sol LeWitt has a memory of her like ignoring the waitress in a restaurant and only speaking like when she really has to, and like I think only to her mother later in her life. And I think, I don't know if it was just like her getting a bit crazy or if it was all really intentional.
Yeah, I mean, it's very intense. It's a very sort of broad statement. And again, I was in the same article that'll link in the show notes if it like, and people should read it. It's very, very fascinating. Again, but it's very much projecting a feminist viewpoint on it. There's this whole debate that in her not speaking to women and only speaking to men, she's trying to highlight that in the art world, that's not a problem because she's only speaking to men in the art world. So in that sort of space, it's fine.
Yeah.
But then if she's doing it in conjunction with Dropout, it's
Like, who is she speaking to?
Yeah.
Is she speaking to anyone? I mean, there is a lot of like solitude, the idea of like her sitting there with her journals and writing her ideas, which all lead to her isolation. And I think there was just a lot of like, she did want to be more anonymous than she was. And even when she was making all her work, it was never her intention to like have her show at the Whitney or do these things. They just happened to her. But she didn't like work for fame. Obviously, she worked for herself and to have the ideas.
Mm.
Like I remember reading like when she died, she asked to be buried in an unmarked grave.
Yes.
Yeah. It's like it all makes me think that she really didn't, I don't know, like she didn't want to have her artistic persona. But then I also read that before she moved out of New York, left all of her private books with her friends as to sort of preserve them or for posterity or something. Which is
Mm.
also interesting. So I'm not really sure where I'm going with this, but there's like two sides to it, I think.
Yeah, there's that sort of yin and yang to her whole life. She'll say this, but she'll do another. In equal measures, she won't speak to women, but she'll, because that's not an issue because she's only talking to men in the art world, but then she'll also drop out of the art world. Like there's a lot of like, yeah, she's a very sort of confusing character, shall we say. But I also think really, and again, I'm going to use this rubbish word, she's really brave. It's really ballsy actually to be quite a successful artist and be like, yeah, I'm not here for this. I'm not here for this. Because a lot of people are so hungry for the acclaim and for the sales and to have that career. There's almost to walk away from it once you get it is not really an option for a lot of people unless you have an absolute breakdown, which debatable she also might have I mean
I mean, I think without the pieces of paper, it probably would have just been described as a breakdown.
yeah.
But I think the way she formalizes it just makes us go like this, it does have that intention, like we're supposed to be shocked by it, borderline disgusted by it, or like there's supposed to be feelings of disagreement, like she wants us to disagree with what she's doing.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah.
No, I find she is so, so fascinating. And I can't believe that considering, a couple of days ago, or until you wrote my open call, a few months ago now, I'd never heard of her. And now I'm sort of like, I really want to like sink my teeth into this further. And if anyone is interested as well, as I mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, that Hauser and Worth, I believe, represent her estate. And I'll leave some links in the show notes below, but they had not a retrospective, but a show of Lee's a few years ago. And there's talks and there's a big panel discussion that's like an hour and a half long where people are like debating her paintings. So if you want to know more about that, those resources are in the show notes below. Now, Kelly, at the start, before we hit record, I did say that you're an artist and you dabble in performance work. As a performance artist or someone that dabbles in performance art, apologies, because you're multidisciplinary, what's your thoughts on this being recreated or your thoughts on doing this from an artist's perspective?
Dabble is a great word. We definitely dabble. Well, I think like for me, like performance it can be really good and really bad.
Mm.
And I think maybe like there's some of that in Lee's work as well, where it's like she loves it because it's like the idea is going really well, but obviously it's really bad materially. Like she's getting evicted, all sorts of things. I don't see, this is the thing as well, like how private does she want things to be? She writes on the front of her notebooks, private book, but then gives them to someone, the future. Yeah, like in terms of like recreating and exhibitions on her, anything that's like a recreation that's not just like the singular piece of paper that was found at her house.
Mm.
I'm not sure if she would like it. But then I'm like, obviously when an artist dies, they have absolutely no control of their estate or
Yeah.
anything. I don't know if I answered the question.
No, well, yeah, I think it's a great insight. Performance can be good and bad, and there's elements of that. Again, back to that yin and yang. There's good and bad in this element. And I think again, part of me is like when you were talking about the books that she had, they were marked as private, but then she handed it to somebody. Could you am I reaching here? Have we been talking about performance pieces for too long? Is that a performance in itself, pretending you want it to be private, but actually you're playing on people's curiosity, their very nature of being human, that they're going to want to open these things and read through them? Particularly if you gift something that says private. Why would you do that? Why would you gift something that says private to someone?
Like, it was obviously like she left them in New York because that was where her career was. She could have taken them with her and, I don't know, kept them with her parents and they still would have been discovered probably. But I think there was more of an intent in that action to keep them where the action is.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So there's like a higher chance of them, maybe, I don't know, this is just me speculating, like there's a higher chance of them being discovered. And it could be like she's 100% dropping out, but there's like a tiny part of her that maybe still wants
might come back.
Thing, yeah.
Or could it be that she sees her life in stages, like she was in Chicago, then she was in New York. These pieces are meant to be performed in New York so they can stay in New York.
Yeah.
So then if they're still physically there, they're still technically being performed even when she's not physically there because the instruction is there. Again, speculation.
See, I think that like unlike the other Fluxus works, you could perform these. Like I could perform these, but I wouldn't because I think when she writes the instruction, it's so specific to her.
Yeah.
It's like, I could like smoke weed for 33 days, but it doesn't have the same ring as like when you read a Yoko Ono piece that says like stand on a hill, like that seems like she's asking you to do it.
Yeah.
These are like so personal and like clinical and like they're for her specifically, seems like.
I know, I love it. And I completely agree with you. Like there's something very instructive to you. Again, it sort of links back to the very sort of solitary nature of her as a person and her as a performer. There was never anyone else invited into it. It was more just what she chose to do. Kelly, thank you so much for coming on and talking about Lee Lozano. I have loved this. I can't believe how into this I am. Like, I'm literally going to go and watch a lecture that Hauser and Worth have once we hang up. I'm completely obsessed. Kelly, before you go, do you want to tell everybody a little bit about yourself and where they can connect with you and find you?
Yeah, I'm an artist. That's it. And you can find me at my website, kellywoo.co.uk.
Perfect. And I'll leave a link to the show notes. I'll leave a link to your website, rather, in the show notes below. Kelly, now I've kept you for nearly an hour, but before you go, I don't know if you've listened to the podcast before. It is not a requirement, but I end each episode by asking every guest the same question. And it's a bit of a big one. So you can take it as sort of wide-reaching or as personal to yourself as you want.
Okay.
It's quite a big one. So my question is, why is art important?
Oh my God, I have no idea. And I didn't know this.
I don't ever warn anyone, and this is the reaction I get every time. Okay,
my answer is, it's not. We're just doing it just like we're doing everything else, I think.
Oh.
Is that a bad answer? Oh my God.
No, I've never had that. It's not. We're just doing it.
Just like in the way that nothing is. Nothing really is that important.
Wow.
I feel like that's a really like Lee Lozano answer.
It really is. And I did say to you before I hit record, I can see the synergy. Oh my goodness. Well, in the 80 plus episodes, no one's ever answered with, it's not. I absolutely love it. Kelly, thank you so much. It's been amazing talking to you.
Thank you for having me.
And there you have it, another episode of Jo's Art History Podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you have enjoyed this episode, please make sure that you are following along on whatever platform you are listening to, or if you're watching us on YouTube, to like, rate and subscribe to the channel. Both of these things help the podcast grow week on week. If you would like to support the podcast in some way, please consider sharing this episode with a friend or relative that you think would also enjoy listening to it, or posting it on social media. This really does help build the listener database, and it's very much appreciated from my side of things. If you're also feeling a little bit generous and you would like to support the future of the podcast and future episodes, please consider purchasing a book from my Amazon wishlist, which is in the show notes below. And everything that you purchase comes straight to me and goes towards research for a future episode, or even equipment to make the podcast sound better and better season on season. If you would like to get in touch, please feel free to do so. You can email me, joesarthistory@gmail.com, or you can connect and find me on Instagram, which is @joesarthistory. Please do feel free to send me a little message. It's always lovely to hear from people. And if you've enjoyed an episode that you've listened to with a guest on it, please also feel free to send guests on the podcast a message as well. It means so much to them that you've engaged with their topic of interest. And a small message really does go a long way. Finally, I've been Jo McLaughlin, your host and resident art historian here on Jo's Art History Podcast, and thank you so much for listening. Until next time, keep learning, and remember, art is for all. Bye.